What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you my first impressions of BioShock Infinite after playing it for the very first time. As I recently completed and reviewed the previous two, it's only natural I take a look at the third and final entry for the time being. There is another one in development though. Whether or not we ever see that remains to be seen, however. But I knew BioShock Infinite was going to be a little bit of an oddity compared to the other two, as it takes place in an entirely new setting with new characters, alongside some shifts in direction that I've heard about but obviously not experienced. However, as is usually the case with games that are pushing 10 years old, your first experience usually doesn't have so much to do with the game as it does getting it running to a satisfactory degree. These days, you'd probably buy Infinite with the collection, which contains all three, with the first two having been remastered. BioShock Infinite did not receive a remaster, as it was already in a pretty good place, which so far has remained pretty true. However, I think there are two things to note. Like the other two, this one also uses the 2K launcher in a very unobtrusive way. You hit play and then that's it. You don't have to sign into anything, and you can actually set the Steam options to bypass it completely, but it does nonetheless pop up every time otherwise. My big problem was actually the UI scaling, as this particular game does not enjoy 4K very much, and the UI will not scale up. So if you play on that, it's either going to be very small or you're going to look for a solution. Luckily, one exists and you don't even need a mod. You do, however, have to go messing around in the game files and basically manually upscale the UI via the settings file, which for some reason isn't in the actual game. That said, as far as older games go, that's a relatively minor problem, and beyond that, the game has ran very well for me. As for the game itself, as many of you I'm sure know, we play as Booker DeWitt in 1912, who is forced into a job to pay off his gambling debts and find the girl, as she's known at the beginning here, but ultimately becomes Elizabeth, as most anyone would know. Nonetheless, though, Booker is forced to go find her to pay off his gambling debts, and we have to make our way to Columbia, a city in the sky. Much like the previous two games, so far, the city itself has kind of been stealing the show, especially since it's basically the complete opposite from what Rapture was. Where Rapture was constrained and oppressive in many ways, Columbia is bright, shiny, and meant to showcase American exceptionalism as part of a World's Fair in 1912, before it got involved with a local rebellion and then ultimately seceded from the United States, before becoming a theocratic police state, worshipping a man named Comstock as a prophet. And it just so happens the woman we are looking for is his daughter, and our coming to Columbia is foretold, so to speak, as they've been watching out for a false shepherd who bears a brand on the back of their hand that we have with the initials AD. So naturally, once that's discovered, things go from 0 to 100 very quickly, and we have to start fighting our way through the city to accomplish our goals. Now that's an interesting enough setup, but what I think is really cool is how they've managed to take a lot of the systems and ideas that play in the first two BioShocks and change them slightly to make more sense here. So instead of plasmids, we have vigors, which are much of the same thing, but there's only 8 of them. The weapons are more reminiscent of the time period, just things like that in general. However, in doing all of that, they've kind of changed the gameplay in subtle ways as well that make it more of a shooter and less of a, let's say, immersive sim. For instance, we don't have health kits that we can carry around with us anymore. They're just pick up on use, or you don't pick them up at all. We also have a shield mechanic now to compensate for our lack of health kits, I imagine. Once the shield's broken, as long as we don't get hit for a little while, it will recharge. On top of that, supplies seem especially abundant. I haven't really had to stop and scrounge for anything. It's mostly just been a linear shooting path through the game thus far, at least through the first 5 or so chapters. And first impressions wise, I'd say that's probably the biggest thing to note, is that there was a clear shift in direction. And while they've retained some of the hallmarks, it definitely feels very different at the same time. And if I had to describe that in a word, it would be streamlined. They took a lot of what was rooted in the world and setting and changed it in a way that makes it ultimately simpler. And while so far it does kind of fit what they're going for here, it does make it feel a bit more on rails than the first two, even though they kind of also were on rails. To give an example, our progression systems are basically infusions, gear, and weapons now. Infusions we can find laying around. If you have the collection one, it'll come with a bunch of DLC that will give you infusions right out of the gate. And you can find infusions for your health, shield, or salts. Salts being what let you use your vigor bigger powers. There's less powers overall, just as an example. We can also find gear or pieces of clothing we don't actually get to see, but provide us with passive bonuses if we have them equipped. And then there's the weapons we pick up, which is a much simpler version of the previous game's already simple progression system. So you can kind of see what I'm getting at here, where the game feels much more streamlined. But on the flip side of that, at the same time, the actual gameplay does feel a bit improved. While I enjoyed my runs of the first two games, they do feel a bit clunky and relatively dated by comparison, just in terms of the actual gunplay and moving around. Ultimately, though, what speaks to me the most about this title is the representation of the city itself and everything it has going for it, while it is ultimately a veneer for lofty ideals that really aren't what are actually being practiced. Much like we saw in Rapture, though in Rapture we saw it in a state of decay after the fact. Columbia were kind of in the moment with it, which I think is a more interesting take. Moving on from here, though, it's probably going to take me 2 playthroughs for the main story and then doing all the DLC. The game is pretty short, though, so it probably won't take me that terribly long to go through this. I'm hoping to have it done by next week before the Aliens TRPG drops. That said, that's all I've got for you guys today. I certainly hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz. Let me know how you feel about BioShock series or BioShock Infinite down in the comment section below. But regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.